Okay, so now we're going to give you an opportunity to really look at identity development synthesized. So rather than us going through all of the identity development models that you were assigned, the Hardiman-Jackson model does a really good job of synthesizing a lot of the common experiences that you'll find in the identity development models for people of color, and juxtaposing it with the similar stages in the Helms-White identity development model. So we're going to use this as a means of explaining them both. One of the things that you'll notice here is that there's an active side and a passive side. So we'll go through as we're explaining both of them. There are things that are actively, consciously happening through direct and intentional messages. And then there are things that, as a result of those messages and socialization that we talked about, things that are happening subconsciously that affect our behavior. You'll notice that there are arrows in between each of these stages. And sometimes these in-between places can function as stages themselves. And that'll make sense when we go through it. Then you'll also notice at the bottom that it's not linear, that you can move through these stages. You might bounce from redefinition to, active acceptance to active resistance. And then it also depends upon your environment and how authentic you can be in any particular environment as to whether or not your identity may come through in one way outside of work and one way inside of work, for example. So we're going to go through both of these. And you'll notice that there'll be a couple of opportunities when Teresita will kind of share her experiences, because one of the reasons I love doing this with Teresita is that Teresita is multiracial. So she has experiences with both the people of color model and experiences with the white model. So we're going to go through these and provide you with an example, several examples of what these stages may look like. And so first you'll notice that the first stage mentions naive and no social consciousness, where you're essentially a blank slate. And this also, you should see some sort of alignment with the cycle of socialization, that in the beginning, everybody's a blank slate, and then something happens to let folks know who's in and who's out, rather. And so then somewhere in between childhood and adolescence for folks of color, that is where that internalized subordination is normalized and acted upon, that something happens where you learn that there's something to being a person of color. And for me, that happened around the age of about 7 when I went to private school and there weren't a whole lot of people of color there. And we were planning a slumber party, and I'll never forget her name. Won't say her name because she might be out there somewhere. Said, well, my mom said that I can't come to your house because you're Black. And she just kind of walked off because apparently it was said very matter-of-factly to her that way. And so that's how it was delivered to me. And that was the first time at age 7 that I really realized there was something to being Black. So usually that happens somewhere with childhood and adolescence. Then an active acceptance as a result of that for people of color, sometimes as a result of getting that message, we start to say to ourselves, we're less than, white people are better, we should emulate them and play it safe in order to be accepted. And Teresita's actually got an example for that.
So if y'all remember in kindergarten on the magic carpet ride, when you would raise your little hand when the teacher would ask you a question, I would do so. And I noticed that my teacher would never call on me. So I started to feel like I didn't belong in school, pretended sick. And my mom caught on me, forcing myself to vomit because I didn't want to go to school. So she met with the teacher and asked if I was being bullied, what was going on. And the teacher said, well, I never call on your daughter because I do not know how to pronounce her name. And there, my mom said, well, just call her Terry, and stormed off. And that's when my mom used active acceptance so I could fit into the dominantly white school that I was attending at that time.
So that's what's happening consciously. Subconsciously, and passive acceptance for people of color, because they have told themselves that we're less than, that white people are better, that's when a lot of times some of their perspectives may reflect the dominant perspectives. So essentially ascribing or aspiring to whiteness and sort of white mindsets. And that's when you also start to see in passive acceptance cognitive dissonance in the reflections of the positive and negative messages about yourself. So for me, when I was growing up, my mom used to always color in all of the people in my books brown, so that I would see some brown people all day and, would tell me that Black is beautiful. But, that was bumping up against the messages that I was getting out there about what it meant to be Black. So this is the only place, and you'll notice this on both of the models. Acceptance, whether active or passive, is the only place you get to without choice. Everything else past this stage is a choice. The rest of the things happen up to that point just through natural socialization. So the stage, it often happens for folks of color in adulthood, where it's sort of this critical waking up incident, right? Where as adults, it's like, wait a minute, am I colluding? Did that just happen? And we'll talk about this a little bit later, even with microaggressions, where, you may hear a microaggression and go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. And then you start thinking about speaking up. And then that can become a very different, that can look very differently for people of color. But an active resistance, and again, this is a choice for people of color, often what it looks like is after you have that waking up moment, it's calling out oppression. It's saying, you know what? Yeah, that is oppression. And I'm going to let people know that is oppression. And I'm going to let people know the way that behavior affects me. Well, we all know what sometimes happens when people of color speak up. That is where you might get labeled the angry Black woman or the angry Latina, or why aren't you that docile Asian that we thought that you were going to be. I literally had a friend of mine have someone say that to her because she was calling out oppression. And so that sometimes results in pain because you are being excluded. You may have some anti-dominant feelings, and there may be loss of benefits of calling out oppression. But you don't mind it because you realize that you need to move out of acceptance into active resistance. And I think Teresita has an example of that as well.
Yes, absolutely. So my sophomore year in college and my family studies ethnic course, I learned the word assimilation. And if you all know what the word assimilation is, it's in a nutshell, when you're trying to formulate behaviors and attitudes and things about your own culture to make the dominant culture feel more comfortable and safe with your presence, in a nutshell. So when I learned that word assimilation, I said, oh my gosh, that's what my mom was doing when she shortened my name from Teresita to Terry. So I said, for now on, everyone must call me Teresita or Teresita because that is my birth name. I will no longer go by Terry. And even if that means I could potentially lose a job opportunity, because there is name discrimination out there.
Absolutely. And that's interesting, Teresita, because I've seen that happen, particularly with other Latinx folks, when they realize that their nickname is really anglicized, so that people who are English speakers can just pronounce it or not have to be at least a little bit discomforted in figuring out how to pronounce it. So that's a common one, I think, for many folks of color. So now that's active resistance, where it's like, okay, I'm going to call things out. Now, there are some people of color that will still be in resistance, but because they see how those other people of color were punished and labeled for calling out oppression, they kind of lean back and go, okay, I see what's going on. Yes, this is oppression. Yes, I realize the systems that I'm in are not inclusive, but I see what happens when I speak out. So I'm just going to lean back. And these might be some of the people of color who come to work, go home. They don't want to go to lunch with anybody. They don't want to do anything outside of work. And I think a lot of times it's because they are sitting in a place of resistance, but they know that there might be repercussions for speaking up. So they just do the bare minimum interaction because they realize that they're sort of caught up in this system of oppression. So in between coming out of resistance, that is often a very difficult space and place for people of color to be in, where it's like that process of purging that collusion and cleansing that internalized subordination. And that's quite frankly, from many perspectives, where the field of multicultural counseling came into play, because as people are trying to figure out, well, if I'm not this person that's accepting oppression, then who am I? And then Teresita, I think, has a definition, has an example of this as well.
So when I was at my first university, my first year experience, being multiracial, both Mexican and Italian, I felt like the Latino organizations or the Latinx organizations weren't really accepting me. And I also felt like the white organizations, like the Christian organizations that were dominantly white, were not accepting me. So I left. I left the university, transferred to Arizona State, where I then found the student organization called SIMBA, Students Identifying as Multiracial and Biracial at Arizona State. And I literally was like, oh my gosh, my people. And they said, are you mixed race? And I was like, yes. And I finally found a place where I felt I could be my full authentic self and be both Mexican and Italian in the same space.
That is a perfect example of redefinition. And this is why we have identity-based clubs and employee resource groups, because in this stage of redefinition, this is where you might see self-segregation coming in, because people who are in that identity development stage often want to be with other people who are going through that identity development stage with them, and sort of exploring what does it mean to be a person of color in this place and space. And that's also where you start to see some renaming, some macro renaming of some groups. So as a Black person, I'm speaking from the I perspective, you see that throughout history, where Black people in America went from the N word to Negro to colored to African American to Afro-American to African American, et cetera. That is part of that exploring heritage and renaming stage. For many groups, same thing happens in a lot of other groups of color, and that's often aligned with redefinition. And so then on the other side of redefinition, moving into internalization, that's where people of color begin exploring that new sense of self. And there may be pushback, but they don't care. So if you remember being an active resistance, it's kind of like, okay, I see what happens when people speak out, so I don't want to get labeled as angry. I'm just going to lay back and not engage. But at redefinition is, yes, I'm going to engage. Yes, I'm going to still continue to call out oppression. I know that I have community with other people who may have similar perspectives. So people of color may begin to push back and emerge in this new sense of self. And realizing there may be pushback, they still do that. But they really get to the point of internalization where, Teresita, did you have an example for this one? Okay, so at internalization for people of color, and this is really important, this is where once you've gone through all of these stages, that you realize you can use your relative privilege to advocate for other people, and that it's not a zero-sum game. That just because I use my straight cisgender middle class privilege, for example, to advocate for the queer and trans community, that doesn't mean I'm taking anything away from the Black community. And that's really where internalization comes in. It's empathy for other targeted groups for whom they're change agents. And so you start to use that relative privilege and become an ally and accomplishment, ally or accomplice, pardon me. However, and this is where it goes back to where I said it's not linear. A trigger can send you right back to, say, passive resistance, to maybe passive acceptance even. So that's why it's important to think about that, you know, even if you're evaluating where you may be, and you realize that, well, I'm here in some places and I'm here in some places, that's often common. And some don't get to internalization, and that's okay. Wherever you are is fine. I think a lot of times people see this and they think, oh, I'm supposed to be down there. Wherever you are, based upon your lived experience, is where you are supposed to be. And so that's all for the people of color one. You will notice that the white one looks very much like the one for people of color. The only similarity is that blank slate that only happens maybe until we get to about adolescence, childhood or adolescence. And that is where, as a white person, that internalized domination status is normalized and acted upon. So, you'll hear people say, well, that's why all of those people live in that neighborhood because, they're lazy. Or that's why there are no people of color in your classes, is because people of color don't believe in education. So, you start internalizing those things through those active messages, right? Direct messages given and accepted about other groups, usually not given about the white group, but it's more about we're not one of them. And Teresita had an example for this.
Yeah, thank you, Shani. So when I was a senior in high school, I worked at a clothing store in a mall. And in my first day, I was reading the policy manual. And it literally said in black and white, make sure you watch Black and Mexicans, pretty much believing that people that are all Latinx descent are Mexican specifically. Watch them because they will steal. And being part Mexican, I went up to my manager, who was also multiracial, and asked, like, are we really supposed to follow this policy? Like, do you not see the racism in this? And she was like, unfortunately, that's just what the policy is. You could do what you want to do with that information. But the thing is now that I know that, unfortunately, there have been policies in black and white in manuals, I know that I could pass as white because I am part white and I'm light skinned. So there are times that I do think specifically to myself, to go through and navigate this world, system, stores, environments where I won't be followed. That's active acceptance.
Yeah. And then now passive acceptance kind of goes more to what I was saying about those internalized behavior codes and rationalization. A lot of times for people of color, that would look like, well, I got out of, this bad situation, so you can too. And so, but it's really explaining away, particularly for those who identify as white, what I was talking about earlier, about, well, those people, and again, some of the passive acceptance is use of those people, are in that predicament, not because of the systems that exist to put them there, but it's because it's their own fault. And so again, this is that line where anything beyond here is a choice, that up to this point, it's just accepting the messages that you're getting. However, in adulthood, this is where there's often a waking up moment where you might have a relationship with a person of color that goes against those stereotypes that you may have heard about people of color. It's like, oh, well, you're not like all of those people that my parents said. So are you an exception? Or maybe is what I was told wrong, and maybe I have been part of an oppressive system. And this is also where sometimes white guilt can start to come in and can start to creep in, so that when we're talking about identity development, I think that's a lot of times why people don't want to get to that point, because of the guilt. So again, this line, in order to get past this line, you have to acknowledge that white privilege exists. I think there are a lot of people that feel very uncomfortable about owning white privilege, but if you're one of those people that's like, nope, I grew up poor, or, I had this experience, you're probably still at acceptance. As a white person, if you realize that you have privilege, you own that privilege, you take responsibility for it to leverage it as an ally, then that is what it'll look like to be in active resistance. Did you have something for that?
I'm right in between passive and active.
Teresita, okay, there you go. So passive resistance, again, this is where, first in that stage between acceptance and resistance, this is where you're going, remember, that's where you're going, okay, am I no pressure? Is that person an exception? When you get to passive resistance, you still have to own your privilege. But rather than necessarily actively using allyship, that is where the guilt really kicks in, where it's maybe anger about some of the historical examples of how systemic oppression still continues to affect people of color today. There's guilt, that's when white guilt may come up. And here is the difference, that differently than at passive acceptance, where you've got those internalized behavior codes, where it's those people, again, anytime there's those people, that's a thing, are in that predicament, it's, oh, so this is systemic. And the reason that all the people of color are maybe on this side of town or in these classes is because privilege exists and a system will do what it's designed to do. So that's when, in between active and passive resistance, there's a new social identity where you're reconciling that positive and negative self-view, and you've moved out of the guilt, and you see, and you're able to sort of renegotiate what it means to be white. And I know Teresita had an example for this one.
Yes, thanks, Jenny. My first year experience in college, once again, if you notice, I keep saying college. Definitely a system of socialization. My roommate was Navajo. And I remember during Christopher Columbus Day, she was starting to post all over the walls in our dorm rooms images of Christopher Columbus and labeling him as a rapist, a murderer, a thief, etc. And I'm part Italian. And in my socialization as a child, I actually used to be in Columbus Day parades in Phoenix, Arizona. So I was like, hey, what are you doing? That's my boy. That's Chris. Like, what are you talking about? Him being a rapist and a murderer. And she's like, you didn't know? I'm like, no, I didn't. So she encouraged me to do my research. We had conversation. I did feel a little guilt because that's part of my Italian roots. But instead of getting stuck in the guilt, I actually helped her post up some additional flyers. And till this day, I still do not celebrate Columbus Day.
Yeah.
But I'm still proud of being Italian.
And I think that's important, Teresita, because sometimes what we'll hear from white folks that are engaging in this work is that, they feel like you're trying to make me feel guilty for being white. But it's when you get to this stage where you have an identity independent of stereotyping, affirming your culture, and that one is not better than the other. So notice Teresita said she was still proud of being Italian, but it wasn't through the lens of supremacy. It's I'm white, that doesn't mean I'm better. It just means I'm white. And so this is where I think collectively, looking at white identity that really started probably in the last 20, 30 years of really affirming their culture, engaging in cultural relativism, that one is not better than the other, that is what it looks like to get to redefinition, where you're, and moving from redefinition to internalization, where you're integrating that social identity with your total identity again. So I get it, I'm white. I'm not going to feel guilty about being white. I'm proud of being white, not through the lens of white supremacy, right? Just, I'm proud of being white. I'm proud of who I am. And I think it's really important to understand that it's not through the lens of white supremacy. You can be proud of being white, and it not be through a supremacist lens. It only becomes through a supremacist lens if you see whiteness as the standard, and that everyone else is trying to meet that standard that is typically embraced by the dominant population. So getting to internalization, this is where, and this is a trigger word for me, phrase, where the term politically correct comes out of your lexicon, where you're really embracing cultural humility, where you realize that you want a more equal future. It's not a zero-sum game. I'm not nullifying everything that I had to do, that I had to work for to get what I have, by acknowledging that I have privilege and by using some of that privilege to advocate for other folks. It's these new acts become natural. You're naturally practicing cultural humility. And don't mind the negotiation that sort of comes from every interaction. Again, it's not linear. Something may happen and you bump right over to passive resistance. And if you are not at internalization, it's okay. Again, I say the same thing that I said before, wherever you are is where you're supposed to be. But we hope this helps you kind of seeing what each of these stages look like, better identify where you are and what those stages may look like, so that you're more familiar with and more comfortable with your own identity development.